The warehouse district of Natchez burned with a fury that lit up the Mississippi night like the sun itself had fallen into the water. Ruthanne Lewis stood at the dock's edge, her powerful arms pushing the last flaming cotton bale into the current, watching as the river became a serpent of fire carrying her rage downstream toward the white columns of the Harrington estate. She had been called the strongest woman on the docks, but strength meant nothing when they held your husband's head under water until his lungs filled with the brown water of the Mississippi. Now the same river would deliver her message, written in smoke and flame, and by the time the sun rose over the magnolia trees, Ruthanne would be gone, swallowed by the morning mist, like a ghost who had never existed at all. But how did a woman with nothing but her grief and her muscle turn the mighty Mississippi into a weapon? How did she disappear from a town where every slave's movement was watched and recorded? And what happened to the masters who thought they could drown a man and face no consequences? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Ruthanne Lewis began not with fire but with water, with the endless flow of the Mississippi River that carved through the heart of the South like a vein carrying the lifeblood of commerce and cruelty in equal measure. In the spring of 1857, Ruthanne was 26 years old, though she looked older because the work had carved lines into her face that spoke of burdens no woman should carry. She stood 6 feet tall in her bare feet, with shoulders broad as any man's who worked the docks, and arms thick with muscle that could lift a cotton bale weighing 200 pounds as easily as other women lifted their children. Her skin was the color of polished walnut, darker than most of the other slaves in Natchez, and her eyes held a directness that made white men uncomfortable, though they valued her labor too much to punish her for it. She had been born on the Harrington plantation 15 miles upriver from Natchez, delivered by her mother in a cabin so small that 3 people could barely stand inside it at once, and from the moment she could walk, she had been put to work in ways that built her body into something that resembled a fortress more than a woman. Her husband's name was Isaiah Coltrane, and he belonged to a different master, a merchant named Bartholomew Winters, who owned a smaller operation near the river landing. Isaiah was a carpenter by trade, skilled with his hands in ways that made him valuable, and he had a gentleness about him that seemed impossible, given the world they inhabited. He was shorter than Ruthanne by half a foot, with fingers that could carve wood into shapes so beautiful that even white folks stopped to admire his work. And when he smiled at her, which he did often despite everything, it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. They had married 3 years earlier in a ceremony that held no legal weight, standing before their community in the clearing behind the Baptist church, where free blacks and slaves alike gathered on Sunday afternoons when their masters permitted it. And a preacher named Josiah Hamilton had spoken words over them that bound them together in the eyes of God, if not in the eyes of the law. Ruthanne had worn a dress made from flour sacks that her mother had bleached white and decorated with wildflowers, and Isaiah had carved her a ring from a piece of cherry wood that she wore on a cord around her neck, because wearing it on her finger would have invited questions from white folks who believed slaves had no right to such tokens of commitment. The Harrington plantation where Ruthanne had been born was one of the largest in Adams County, sprawling across 3,000 acres of rich bottomland that produced cotton in quantities that made Harrison Harrington one of the wealthiest men in Mississippi. He was 52 years old in 1857, with silver hair that he wore combed back from a high forehead, and a manner that combined aristocratic grace with the casual cruelty of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. His wife, Victoria, was 10 years younger, a pale beauty who spent her days managing the household slaves with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession, and his 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, were being raised to inherit an empire built on the backs of people like Ruthanne and her family. The overseer of the plantation was a man named Cyrus Dalton, 40 years old and mean as a cottonmouth snake, with a face weathered by sun and alcohol until it resembled cracked leather, and hands that were never far from the whip he carried coiled at his belt. Dalton had come to Mississippi from Georgia 5 years earlier, bringing with him a reputation for getting maximum productivity from slaves through methods that other overseers whispered about but rarely questioned. And Harrington had hired him specifically because he promised to increase the plantation's output by 20% within 2 years. Ruthanne had been assigned to work the docks in Natchez when she turned 18, not because Harrington wanted to lose her labor on the plantation, but because he had discovered that hiring her out to the shipping companies brought in more money than keeping her in the fields. The docks were a chaotic world where steamboats arrived daily, carrying goods from upriver and departed loaded with cotton bales bound for New Orleans and beyond, and the work required strength that most men struggled to provide consistently. Ruthanne could work 12 hours straight loading and unloading cargo, her muscles never seeming to tire, her pace never slowing, even when the summer sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. The shipping company paid Harrington $3 a day for her labor, money that went directly into his pocket, while Ruthanne received nothing except the knowledge that her value kept her relatively safe from the worst abuses that other slaves endured. She walked the 6 miles from the plantation to the docks every morning before dawn, her bare feet following the river road that wound through stands of willow and cottonwood, and she returned every evening after dark, so exhausted that she could barely eat the cornmeal mush and fatback that constituted her dinner before collapsing onto her pallet in the cabin she shared with 4 other women. Isaiah worked in Natchez as well, in a carpentry shop 3 blocks from the docks where his master hired him out to white craftsmen who needed skilled labor. The shop produced furniture and coffins and whatever else customers requested, and Isaiah's reputation for quality work had grown to the point where white men specifically asked for pieces he had made. His master collected most of his wages, but allowed him to keep a small percentage, perhaps 10 cents out of every dollar he earned, and Isaiah saved this money with a dedication that bordered on religious fervor because he and Ruthanne shared a dream that seemed impossible but sustained them nonetheless. They wanted to buy their freedom, to somehow accumulate the $1,500 that Harrington would demand for Ruthanne and the $1,000 that Winters wanted for Isaiah, sums so large they seemed like fantasy numbers plucked from thin air. At the rate they could save, it would take them 40 years to gather that much money, by which time they would be old and broken, but they saved anyway because the alternative was accepting that they would die as property, and neither of them could bear that thought. They saw each other on Sunday afternoons when both their masters permitted them time away from work, meeting at the clearing behind the Baptist church, where they could sit together on a fallen log and talk about small things that made their lives bearable. Isaiah would tell her about the furniture he was building, describing the grain of the wood and the joints he was crafting with such care that she could picture each piece in her mind, and she would tell him about the steamboats she had seen that week. Great vessels with names like Princess of the South and Mississippi Queen that seemed like floating palaces compared to the rough world of the docks. Sometimes they would walk along the river together, following animal paths through the undergrowth where they could pretend for a few hours that they were free people taking a leisurely stroll rather than slaves stealing moments between periods of labor. Isaiah would pick wildflowers for her, presenting them with a courtly bow that made her laugh despite everything, and she would tuck them into her hair where they would remain until they wilted and fell away. Small bursts of color in a world that seemed determined to drain all beauty from their lives. The trouble began in early April of 1857, when Cyrus Dalton came to Natchez on business and saw Ruthanne working at the docks. He had been sent by Harrington to collect payment from the shipping company and to negotiate rates for the coming season, and he arrived at midday when the work was at its most intense. Ruthanne was loading cotton bales onto a flatboat, working alongside 6 men who struggled to match her pace, and Dalton stood watching her for nearly an hour with an expression on his face that made the other slaves nervous. When she finished her shift, he approached her on the dock, standing close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and the tobacco juice staining his gray beard, and he told her that Harrington wanted her back at the plantation. She knew this was a lie because she had heard nothing from the master about any change in her assignment, but contradicting an overseer was dangerous enough that she simply nodded and asked when she should report. Dalton smiled then, showing tobacco-stained teeth, and told her to finish out the week, but that come Monday she would be back in the fields where she belonged. That evening, Ruthanne walked home with dread sitting in her stomach like a stone because she knew what returning to the plantation meant. The money Harrington earned from hiring her out would disappear, replaced by whatever minimal value her fieldwork provided, and her dream of someday buying her freedom would die completely. More than that, she would be under Dalton's direct supervision every day, subject to his whims and his temper without the slight protection that distance and the shipping company's interest in her well-being provided. She thought about running, about following the North Star that Isaiah had taught her to identify. But running meant leaving Isaiah behind, and that was a price she could not pay. When she reached the plantation that night, she went to find her mother in the cabin they had once shared, and she told her what Dalton had said. Her mother, whose name was Dinah, and who was 47 years old, but looked 70, because the work and the sorrow had consumed her from the inside out, listened with the stillness of someone who had heard too many terrible things to react with shock anymore. And then she told Ruthanne something that changed everything. Dalton had a reputation, her mother said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might carry tales to dangerous ears. He favored young women, particularly those who showed strength or spirit, and he broke them systematically through combinations of violence and violation that left them hollow shells. 3 women in the past 2 years had been targeted by him, her mother explained, and one had tried to fight back by complaining to Harrington, who had punished her for lying about a white man by selling her south to a plantation in Louisiana, where conditions were so brutal that it amounted to a death sentence. Another woman had simply disappeared one night, running despite knowing she had no real chance of making it to freedom, and she had been caught 3 days later and whipped so severely that she died from infection a week afterward. The third woman still worked in the fields, but something inside her had broken so completely that she moved through each day like a ghost, never speaking, never making eye contact, existing in some internal place where the world could not touch her anymore. Ruthanne listened to this catalog of horrors with rage building in her chest like a fire that needed air to breathe. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would not let Dalton break her the way he had broken the others. She was stronger than them, not because she was better, but because circumstances had made her strong in ways that went beyond muscle and bone. She had spent 8 years working alongside men who respected her because she could outwork them, and she had built an identity around her strength that would not easily be torn down. But she also understood that strength alone would not protect her from a white man with the law on his side and a master who valued profit over human decency. She needed a plan, needed some way to either escape Dalton's attention or make the cost of targeting her too high for him to pay. She thanked her mother and walked back to her cabin, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead nowhere. On Sunday, she met Isaiah at their usual spot and told him everything. He listened with growing horror, his gentle face transforming into something harder than she had ever seen. And when she finished speaking, he took both her hands in his and told her they would run. They would leave that very night, would follow the underground railroad that everyone whispered about but few had actually used, and they would make it to freedom or die trying, because living under Dalton's rule was not living at all. Ruthanne felt her heart break a little because she knew Isaiah was serious, knew he would throw away his skill and his small savings and his relative safety to protect her. But she also knew they would not make it. They had no contacts in the Underground Railroad, no map to guide them. And masters in Mississippi were quick to organize hunting parties with dogs that could track a person across miles of wilderness. Running would be suicide, she told him, and she would not let him throw his life away for her sake. They argued in whispers there in the clearing, their voices never rising above the level of the wind through the pine trees, because even in their desperation, they knew that volume meant danger. Isaiah insisted they had to try, that he would not stand by while Dalton destroyed the woman he loved, and Ruthanne insisted that they needed to be smarter than that, needed to find some other way to survive. Finally, as the sun began to set, and they knew they had to return to their respective masters' properties, they reached a compromise. Isaiah would ask around carefully among the other slaves, seeking information about possible escape routes or contacts who might help them, and Ruthanne would delay returning to the plantation by claiming illness, by working more slowly at the docks, by doing whatever she could to buy them time to form a real plan. They kissed before parting, a desperate press of lips that felt like goodbye even though neither of them acknowledged it. And then they walked away in opposite directions, each carrying the weight of impossible choices. The next week passed in a blur of anxiety and forced normalcy. Ruthanne worked at the docks with her usual efficiency, because drawing attention through laziness would only make things worse, and each evening she returned to the plantation, half expecting to find Dalton waiting to enforce his order that she return to field work. But Monday came and went, without incident, and then Tuesday and Wednesday followed the same pattern, and she began to hope that perhaps he had forgotten or changed his mind or been distracted by some other concern. On Thursday afternoon, Isaiah appeared at the docks during his lunch break, something he had never done before because the risk of being caught away from his assigned work was too great. He pulled her aside behind a stack of cargo crates where they could not be seen from the main dock, and he told her in rushed whispers that he had found someone who claimed to know an Underground Railroad conductor, a free black man who lived in Natchez and who helped slaves escape for a price. The price was steep, Isaiah explained. $50 per person, which meant they would need $100 total, a sum that seemed as impossible as the $1,500 they needed for freedom, but at least theoretically achievable. Isaiah had $47 saved from years of keeping his small percentage of earnings, and Ruthanne had $12 that she had managed to accumulate through small amounts that other dock workers had given her over the years. in gratitude for her help with difficult loads. That left them $41 short, and they had no way to earn that much quickly enough to matter. But the contact had told Isaiah that there might be another option, that sometimes slaves earned their passage through information by providing details about patrol routes or masters' schedules or anything else that might help future escapes. Isaiah had been cautious in his response, neither agreeing nor refusing, because he knew that sharing such information carried its own dangers. But he had arranged for them to meet this conductor on Friday night in an alley behind a dry goods store on Franklin Street. Friday evening arrived heavy with humidity that promised rain, and Ruthanne walked into Natchez after her shift ended with her stomach churning with equal parts hope and dread. She met Isaiah outside the Baptist church at dusk, and together they made their way through streets that emptied quickly as night fell, because slaves found outside after dark without passes faced immediate punishment. The alley behind the dry goods store was narrow and dark, flanked by brick buildings that seemed to lean inward. And at first Ruthanne thought they had come to the wrong place, because she saw no one waiting. Then a figure detached itself from the shadows near a stack of barrels, revealing itself to be a man of perhaps 50 years, with gray shot through his close-cropped hair and eyes that assessed them with the wariness of someone who had survived by trusting no one completely. His name was Marcus, he told them, and he made no claim to be part of the Underground Railroad, but admitted he knew people who knew people, and sometimes he could help slaves who were desperate enough and smart enough to follow instructions exactly. Marcus listened as Ruthanne and Isaiah explained their situation, his face revealing nothing as they described Dalton's reputation and the impossible choice they faced between running unprepared and staying to be destroyed. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from one to the other, as if measuring their courage or their foolishness. Finally, he told them that he could get them out, could smuggle them north in a wagon hidden beneath a false floor that would take them to the next station on the route to freedom. But the journey was dangerous, and many people did not survive it. Some were discovered at checkpoints and returned to their masters to face punishment that made death look merciful. Others suffocated in the hidden compartments when journeys took longer than expected, or when they panicked and made noise that drew attention. Still others made it north, only to find that freedom without money or connections meant a different kind of slavery, grinding poverty and discrimination that ground people down almost as effectively as the plantation system. Despite these warnings, Ruthanne and Isaiah told Marcus they wanted to go, that they would take their chances with the journey rather than accept what waited for them in Mississippi. Marcus nodded as if this was the answer he expected, and then he told them the practical details. The wagon would leave on Sunday night from a farm 3 miles north of Natchez, and they needed to be there by midnight because the driver would not wait even 1 minute past the appointed time. They needed to bring nothing with them except the clothes on their backs, because any belongings would take up space in the cramped hiding spot and might make noise that could betray them. They needed to understand that once they climbed into that wagon they were committed, that there would be no turning back even if they changed their minds, and that if they were caught, they could not reveal Marcus's name or any other details about how they had arranged the escape, because doing so would destroy the entire network and condemn other desperate people to the hell they were trying to escape. The price was $100 as Isaiah had been told, or alternatively, they could provide information that Marcus deemed valuable enough to offset the cost. Ruthanne and Isaiah looked at each other in the darkness of that alley, and without speaking they reached the same conclusion. They pooled their money, $59 that represented years of sacrifice and saving, and they promised Marcus they would get him the remaining $41 by Sunday evening. He looked skeptical, clearly doubting that they could raise such a sum in less than 48 hours, but he told them where to bring the money if they managed it. And then he disappeared back into the shadows, as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving them alone in the alley, with the weight of an impossible deadline hanging over them. They walked back through the dark streets in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about how to acquire $41 when they had no possessions of value and no way to earn money quickly. When they reached the point where they had to separate to return to their respective properties, Isaiah took Ruthanne's hands again and told her he had an idea, though he would not explain what it was no matter how much she pressed him. He made her promise to meet him on Saturday evening at their usual spot, and then he kissed her forehead in a gesture that felt like a blessing and walked away into the darkness, leaving her standing alone with questions multiplying in her mind. Saturday came with clouds building in the south and tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Ruthanne worked at the docks with her mind elsewhere, thinking about Isaiah's mysterious idea and wondering if they were making a terrible mistake by trusting Marcus, a man they barely knew who could just as easily be working with slave catchers as with the Underground Railroad. When her shift ended, she cleaned herself as best she could with water from the rain barrel behind the warehouse, and then made the walk to the clearing behind the church, arriving just as the sun touched the western horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for such a dark day. Isaiah was already waiting, sitting on their fallen log with something bundled in a cloth on his lap. And when he saw her, his face split into a smile that looked equal parts triumphant and terrified. He had the money, he told her. $41 that would complete what they needed to pay Marcus. Ruthanne felt her heart leap with hope before dread immediately crushed it down. Because she knew there was no legitimate way for Isaiah to have acquired that much money overnight. She asked him how he had done it, her voice barely above a whisper, and he told her a story that made her blood run cold. He had stolen it from Bartholomew Winters, his master, had waited until the house was empty except for the elderly slave woman who cooked and cleaned, and had broken into the study where Winters kept a lockbox hidden behind a false panel in the wall. Isaiah had known about the hiding place because he had done carpentry work in that room months earlier, and had noticed the panel did not quite match the surrounding wood, and desperation had given him courage he did not know he possessed. The lockbox had contained almost $300 in mixed bills, and Isaiah had taken only 41, hoping that Winters might not notice immediately if the theft was small enough, or might blame it on one of the many visitors who passed through the house on business. Ruthanne listened to this confession with horror building in her chest, because she understood immediately what Isaiah did not seem to grasp. Winters would notice, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon he would open that lockbox and count the money inside, and when he discovered the theft, he would tear apart his household looking for the culprit. He would question every slave, would threaten and intimidate, and probably beat people until someone provided information or until he simply decided who to blame based on suspicion and convenience. And Isaiah, with his access to the study and his skill with locks and his sudden absence on Sunday night, would be the obvious suspect, even if they made it onto Marcus's wagon and out of Mississippi. Winters would pursue them with the fury of a man who had been robbed by his own property, and the network of slave catchers and informants that spread across the South would make escape exponentially more difficult. But the money was already stolen, the die already cast, and dwelling on might have beens would accomplish nothing. They had a chance now, slim though it was, and they had to take it, because the alternative was returning the money and facing Dalton's plans for Ruthanne, which was no alternative at all. They agreed to meet at the designated farm on Sunday night at 11:30, giving themselves enough time to arrive well before midnight, but not so early that they would be noticed lurking around someone's property. Isaiah wrapped the money back in its cloth and gave it to Ruthanne for safekeeping because her size and strength made her less likely to be stopped and searched by white men who tended to fear her physical presence. They spent the next hour sitting together on the log, not talking much, but simply being present with each other, storing up memories of touch and proximity against the uncertainty that awaited them. When full darkness fell, they parted with another desperate kiss, and Ruthanne walked back toward the plantation with the stolen money hidden in a pocket she had sewn into her dress, and prayers she did not quite believe in running through her mind. Sunday morning arrived clear and hot, the storm that had threatened the previous day having moved off to the east without dropping rain. Ruthanne went through the motions of the day in a haze of anxiety, attending the slave gathering at the church, where a visiting preacher spoke about Moses leading his people out of Egypt, words that seemed to carry special resonance, given what she and Isaiah planned to do that night. She barely heard the sermon, though, her mind occupied with logistics and fears and the 100 things that could go wrong with their escape attempt. When the gathering ended, she walked back to the plantation and spent the afternoon in her cabin, trying to rest because she knew the night would require all her strength, but finding sleep impossible because her thoughts raced like rabbits, fleeing hounds. At dusk she rose and changed into her sturdiest dress, the one she wore for dock work, because it was thick enough to provide some protection against rough surfaces and brambles. She took nothing else with her except the money wrapped in its cloth, leaving behind the few possessions she had accumulated over her 26 years, because Marcus had been clear about traveling light. She left the plantation at 9 o'clock, walking openly along the road toward Natchez, as if she had business in town, because furtive movement attracted more attention than boldness. The road was empty at this hour. Most people already settled in for the night, and she made good time despite the darkness forcing her to watch her footing carefully. When she reached Natchez, she skirted the main streets and moved through alleys and back ways that she had learned during her years working the docks, emerging finally onto the north road that led out of town toward the farm where Marcus had told them to meet. This part of the journey felt most dangerous, because the road was exposed, and slaves traveling alone at night were immediately suspect. But she encountered no one during the 3-mile walk except a few frogs calling from the ditches and an owl that watched her pass with luminous eyes. The farm appeared as a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky. A house and barn and various outbuildings arranged around a central yard. Ruthanne approached cautiously, staying in the tree line until she could verify that this was indeed the right place. And after a few minutes, she spotted Isaiah standing near the barn door, his silhouette unmistakable even in the darkness. She crossed the open ground quickly and joined him, and together they waited in the shadows, speaking in whispers about nothing important, because the real conversations had already happened, and now there was only the waiting. 11:30 became 11:45, and then midnight approached with no sign of Marcus or the promised wagon. and Ruthanne felt despair beginning to curl around her heart like smoke, the possibility that they had been deceived or abandoned, beginning to seem more real than the possibility of escape. Then, at 5 minutes before midnight, they heard the creak of wagon wheels and the soft clopping of horse hooves, and a covered wagon emerged from the darkness driven by a white man they had never seen before. Marcus appeared from somewhere near the house, moving quickly to the back of the wagon, where he pulled aside the canvas cover to reveal a false floor that lifted up on hinges to expose a space beneath perhaps 2 feet deep and 6 feet long. It looked like a coffin, Ruthanne thought, a mobile grave that would either carry them to freedom or become the place where they suffocated in darkness. Marcus gestured for them to hand over the money, and Ruthanne retrieved the cloth bundle from her pocket and passed it to him. He counted it quickly by the light of a shuttered lantern, his fingers moving through the bills with practiced efficiency, and then he nodded and pointed to the hidden compartment. Isaiah climbed in first, having to lie flat on his back with his arms at his sides because the space was barely wide enough to accommodate his shoulders. Ruthanne followed, her greater size making the fit even tighter, and she had to turn slightly onto her side to fit next to Isaiah in the cramped darkness. Marcus handed them a canteen of water and told them not to make a sound no matter what they heard, no matter how long the journey took, no matter how uncomfortable they became, because one noise at the wrong time would get them all killed. Then he lowered the false floor, plunging them into absolute darkness, and they heard him piling cargo on top of it, bags of feed or produce that would disguise the compartment's existence and add weight that made breathing even more difficult. The wagon lurched into motion, and Ruthanne felt Isaiah's hand find hers in the darkness, his fingers interlacing with hers in a grip that spoke of love and fear and determination all at once. The journey that followed existed outside normal time, stretching into an eternity of discomfort and terror. The space was too small to shift position, forcing them to remain motionless even when their muscles screamed for movement, and the air grew thick and stale despite small ventilation holes drilled through the false floor. They heard voices at what must have been checkpoints, white men questioning the driver about his cargo and destination, and during these stops Ruthanne had to focus every ounce of her will on remaining silent, even though her heart hammered so hard she was certain it would give them away. The wagon stopped and started, turned onto different roads, climbed hills and descended into valleys, and through it all she and Isaiah lay pressed together in their coffin-shaped hiding place, breathing as shallowly as possible and praying in their separate ways that this gamble would pay off. After what felt like days, but was probably only 6 or 7 hours, the wagon stopped, and the false floor was lifted, flooding the compartment with gray dawn light that seemed as bright as the sun itself. After so long in darkness, they were in a barn, unfamiliar surroundings somewhere far from Natchez, and a different man, black like Marcus but older with white hair and kind eyes, was helping them out of the hiding place. Their muscles had cramped from the long period of immobility, and they could barely stand at first, leaning on each other and on the stranger as feeling gradually returned to their limbs in painful tingles. The man, who introduced himself as James, told them they were 30 miles north of Natchez in the town of Fayette, and that they would rest here for the day before continuing north that night in a different wagon driven by a different driver. The pattern would repeat, he explained, a series of short journeys in hidden compartments, interspersed with brief periods of rest in safe houses, until eventually they crossed into free territory, where they could stop hiding and start living. They spent the day in James's barn, sleeping on hay in a loft that seemed luxuriously spacious after the cramped wagon compartment, and James's wife brought them food, cornbread, and beans and ham that tasted better than anything Ruthanne had ever eaten, simply because it was food she chose to accept, rather than food given to her by masters. As the sun climbed toward noon, and they lay in the hay recovering their strength, Isaiah pulled Ruthanne close and whispered that they were going to make it, that they were actually going to be free, and for the first time since this desperate plan had begun, she allowed herself to believe him. They had survived the first leg of the journey, had made it farther than many people ever did, and if their luck held, they might actually escape Mississippi and build a life where they belonged to no one but themselves. That evening, as they prepared for the next leg of their journey, a boy of perhaps 12 came running into the barn with news that shattered their fragile hope. Slave catchers were in Fayette, asking questions about runaways, showing descriptions that matched Isaiah and Ruthanne, offering reward money of $200 for information leading to their capture. Bartholomew Winters had discovered the theft from his lockbox, had connected it to Isaiah's carpentry work and access to the study, and had sent men north with orders to search every town and question every person until the runaways were found. More than that, the boy reported. Harrison Harrington had joined the search when he learned that Ruthanne was also missing, not because he particularly cared about one slave, but because her escape represented a loss of income that offended his sense of property rights. Between them, the two masters had put up a combined reward large enough that every slave catcher and bounty hunter in Mississippi would be looking for them. James listened to this news with a grim expression, and then he told Isaiah and Ruthanne that they could not continue north by wagon because the route had been compromised. The slave catchers would be watching the roads, stopping wagons, and searching for hidden compartments, and the risk of discovery was too high. But there was another option, more dangerous but potentially more effective. The Mississippi River ran past Fayette, and a sympathetic steamboat captain sometimes carried runaways hidden among his cargo. If they could get aboard without being seen, the boat was called the River Belle, and it departed for Memphis at midnight. And if Isaiah and Ruthanne could somehow get onto it before then, they might be able to reach Tennessee before the slave catchers realized they were no longer traveling by road. Ruthanne understood immediately what James was suggesting, could see the parallel to her own life in the solution he proposed. She had spent 8 years working the docks, had learned the rhythms of loading and unloading cargo, had become familiar with the ways steamboats operated, and the blind spots where slaves working the docks could move without constant supervision. If they could reach the landing where the River Belle was moored, if they could time their approach to coincide with the chaos of loading, they might be able to slip aboard in the confusion and hide among the cargo until the boat departed. It was a desperate plan with countless ways to fail. But then again, everything they had done for the past 3 days had been desperate, and desperation had carried them this far. They left James's barn as soon as darkness fell, moving through backways and avoiding the main streets of Fayette, just as Ruthanne had avoided the main streets of Natchez the night before. The river landing was a mile from town, a collection of warehouses and docks where boats stopped to take on cotton and other goods headed north. And as they approached, they could hear the sounds of men working, the thud of cargo hitting deck boards, and the shouts of overseers directing the loading. The River Belle was a mid-sized steamboat, nothing like the grand vessels Ruthanne had seen in Natchez, but large enough to carry substantial cargo, and its decks were brightly lit by lanterns that turned the night into a stage where every movement could be seen. They watched from the shadows for an hour, studying the patterns of movement, identifying the moments when attention was focused elsewhere, and a person might slip aboard without being noticed. The opportunity came when a wagon arrived carrying a load of barrels that required multiple men to lift and carry, and, in the confusion of organizing this difficult task, Ruthanne and Isaiah moved. They crossed the open ground at a fast walk, not running because running would draw attention, and they climbed the gangplank with the confidence of people who belonged there. 2 more workers in a night full of workers. Once on deck, they moved quickly toward the bow where cotton bales were stacked in rows that created a maze of passages and hiding spots, and they squeezed themselves into a gap between bales near the front of the boat, where they would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. The loading continued for another 2 hours, during which Ruthanne and Isaiah remained motionless in their hiding place, barely breathing, as workers moved cargo around them and came within feet of their position multiple times. Finally, at 10 minutes past midnight, the boat's whistle blew 3 long blasts, and the paddle wheel began to turn, churning the brown water of the Mississippi into foam as the river bell pulled away from the dock and headed north into the darkness. They had made it aboard, had successfully escaped Fayette and the slave catchers who were searching for them there. But they were far from safe. The boat would make stops at multiple towns between here and Memphis, and at any of those stops, someone might search the cargo and discover them. All they could do was remain hidden, remain silent, and hope that their luck continued to hold. The journey upriver took the better part of 3 days, the river bell making frequent stops to load and unload cargo at plantations and small towns that lined the Mississippi. At each stop, Ruthanne and Isaiah pressed themselves as deep into their hiding place as possible, listening to the sounds of commerce happening around them and praying that no one would need to access the particular bales that concealed them. They had no food except a few biscuits that James's wife had given them, and water was rationed from the single canteen they had managed to bring aboard. Thirst and hunger became constant companions, gnawing at them with increasing intensity as the hours stretched into days. But they endured because the alternative was discovery and the terrible punishment that would follow. On the 3rd day, somewhere in Tennessee, based on fragments of conversation they overheard from passing crew members, disaster struck. A deckhand noticed something odd about the arrangement of cotton bales near the bow, a gap that should not have been there, and he pulled aside one of the bales to investigate. He found Isaiah and Ruthanne pressed into their hiding place, exhausted and dehydrated, and past the point where they could even run, and his shout of discovery brought the captain and half the crew running. They were dragged out onto the deck, blinking in the sudden brightness of daylight, and the captain stood over them with fury written across his weathered face. He was a heavy-set man of perhaps 50, with gray mutton-chop whiskers and a voice that could cut through the sound of the paddle wheel, and he demanded to know who they were and how they had gotten aboard his boat. Ruthanne found her voice first, though it came out as a croak because her throat was parched from lack of water. She told him they were runaways from Mississippi, that they had come aboard in Fayette seeking passage to freedom, and that they had no money to pay for it but would work to earn their passage if he would let them. The captain listened with an expression that revealed nothing, and when she finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to Isaiah's and back again. Finally, he asked if they were the runaways that Harrington and Winters were searching for, the ones with the $200 reward on their heads. And Ruthanne saw no point in lying, so she nodded. The captain nodded in return, as if this confirmed something he had suspected, and then he told his crew to bring rope. For a terrible moment, Ruthanne thought he was going to have them tied up and delivered to the nearest authorities to claim the reward money, and she tensed her muscles, preparing to fight even though she knew it would be futile against so many men. But instead of binding them, the captain had his crew rig a rope ladder over the side of the boat, and he told Isaiah and Ruthanne that they were getting off right here, right now, and that if they were smart, they would head east away from the river, because every town along the Mississippi would be watching for them. He could not harbor runaways, he explained, because doing so would cost him his captain's license and probably his boat if he was caught. But neither would he deliver them back to slavery for money. They were in Tennessee now, he told them, free territory as far as the law was concerned, though the law was not always enforced when it came to runaways. And if they could make it another 50 miles east to the mountains, they might find communities of free blacks and sympathetic whites who would help them disappear. They climbed down the rope ladder into the shallow water near the riverbank, wading ashore while the river bell continued north without them. And for a long moment they simply stood there, dripping and exhausted, alone in unfamiliar territory, with no food, no money, no plan. But they were alive, and they were together, and they were farther from Mississippi than either of them had ever been. Isaiah took Ruthanne's hand, and they began walking east, following a narrow path that led away from the river into a forest of hickory and oak that seemed to offer both shelter and concealment. They walked for hours, moving as quickly as they could despite their weakened condition, putting distance between themselves and the river where slave catchers might be searching. As the sun began to set on their third day of freedom, they emerged from the forest onto a dirt road and encountered an elderly black man driving a mule cart loaded with firewood. He looked at them with eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize desperation when it appeared in front of him, and without asking questions, he told them to climb into the back of the cart and cover themselves with the wood. He drove them to a small settlement 10 miles farther east, a community of perhaps 50 people living in rough cabins scattered across a hillside, and he brought them to a woman named Ruth, who listened to their story and offered them food and a place to sleep. This settlement, she explained, existed on the margins of the law, a place where runaways and free blacks and poor whites, who wanted nothing to do with slavery, lived side by side and protected each other from authorities, who occasionally came looking for fugitives. Ruthanne and Isaiah stayed in that settlement for 3 weeks, recovering their strength and learning the skills they would need to survive in freedom. They worked alongside the other residents, helping with planting and building and all the tasks required to maintain a community, and gradually they began to believe that they might actually make it, that the life they had dreamed about during those Sunday meetings in Natchez might actually be possible. Isaiah found work with a carpenter in the nearby town, and Ruthanne discovered that her strength was just as valued here as it had been on the docks, except here she was paid for her labor and the money she earned belonged to her. They began saving again, not for freedom this time, but for a future they were actively building. But the past was not finished with them. On a warm afternoon in late May, a little more than a month after they had arrived in Tennessee, A group of men rode into the settlement, asking questions about runaways from Mississippi. They were not official slave catchers, just bounty hunters who had picked up the trail and were hoping to collect the reward money. And they had descriptions of Isaiah and Ruthanne that were detailed enough to be worrying. The settlement's residents lied automatically, claiming they had never seen anyone matching those descriptions, and the bounty hunters left without finding what they were looking for. But the visit shook everyone's sense of security. Ruth told Isaiah and Ruthanne that night that they needed to keep moving, that staying in one place too long was dangerous when there was reward money involved, and that she knew someone farther north who might help them disappear more completely. The news should have devastated Ruthanne, should have filled her with despair at the thought of leaving this place where they had just begun to feel safe. But instead, it filled her with rage. She had run enough. She had hidden enough. She had spent her entire life accommodating the fears and cruelties of white people, and she was tired of being hunted like an animal for the crime of wanting to be free. That night, lying beside Isaiah in the cabin they shared, she told him she wanted to go back, not to stay, not to return to slavery, but to deliver a message that could not be ignored. She wanted Harrington and Winters, and especially Cyrus Dalton, to understand that their actions had consequences, that drowning husbands and breaking women and treating human beings as property came with a price that someone would eventually make them pay. Isaiah listened to this plan with horror because he understood immediately what she was proposing. She wanted revenge, wanted to strike back at the people who had forced them to flee everything they knew, and revenge meant risk of a magnitude that made their escape look cautious by comparison. But he also understood that Ruthanne had reached her breaking point, that the combination of rage and exhaustion and fear had crystallized into something hard and bright and dangerous, and that trying to talk her out of it would accomplish nothing. So, instead of arguing, he asked her what she intended to do, and she told him a plan that was as simple as it was audacious. She would return to Natchez, to the docks where she had worked for 8 years and where she knew every building and every pattern of movement. She would find the warehouse where Harrington stored his cotton before it was loaded onto boats, the warehouse that represented months of profit and the foundation of his wealth, and she would burn it all, would send his fortune up in smoke, and then she would disappear before anyone could stop her. It was madness, Isaiah told her, suicidal madness that would accomplish nothing except getting her killed or captured. But Ruthanne countered that madness had its own logic, that sometimes the only way to be heard was to speak in a language that masters understood, and the language of profit and loss was the only one they truly respected. She would be careful, she promised, would plan it meticulously and execute it quickly, and she would return to Tennessee before anyone even knew she had been there. Isaiah argued against it for hours, but eventually he recognized the futility of his objections and shifted to trying to make the plan as safe as possible. He would come with her, he insisted, would watch her back and help her escape, because she would not face this danger alone. They left the settlement 2 days later, telling Ruth they were heading north to follow her contact, when in reality they were heading south back toward Mississippi. The journey took a week because they had to move carefully, avoiding towns and main roads where they might be recognized, sleeping in forests and abandoned buildings, and begging food from isolated farms where the residents seemed sympathetic. As they drew closer to Natchez, Isaiah made one more attempt to talk Ruthanne out of her plan, but she was resolute in a way that went beyond stubbornness. into something that resembled inevitability. She had made her decision and nothing he said would change it. So he shifted his focus to survival, to making sure that whatever happened, they both came through it alive. They reached the outskirts of Natchez on a Tuesday night in mid-June, arriving after dark, when the streets were quiet and movement was less likely to attract attention. Ruthanne led them to the warehouse district where she had worked, moving through familiar territory with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning every alley and shortcut. The warehouse where Harrington stored his cotton was a large wooden building near the main dock, 3 stories tall and filled with bales awaiting shipment. It was not guarded at night because no one imagined that slaves would be bold enough or foolish enough to damage property, and this assumption was the vulnerability Ruthanne planned to exploit. She and Isaiah waited in the shadows across the street from the warehouse for 2 hours, watching the patterns of movement as the last workers left, and the area settled into nighttime quiet. At midnight they moved. Isaiah kept watch while Ruthanne approached the warehouse's side door, the one that employees used when the main doors were closed, and she found it unlocked just as she had expected because the carelessness of people who felt secure was as predictable as the river's current. Inside, the warehouse was dark except for faint moonlight filtering through high windows, and the smell of cotton was overwhelming, a dry, dusty scent that brought back memories of 8 years of labor. She moved through the space quickly, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, and she began dragging cotton bales into a rough pile near the center of the first floor, where the fire would have room to grow before anyone noticed it. Cotton burned hot and fast once it got started. She knew from seeing accidental fires on the docks, and these bales were compressed so tightly they would feed flames for hours. When she had 15 bales arranged to her satisfaction, she pulled out the flint and steel she had brought from the settlement and began striking sparks onto a piece of cloth she had frayed to serve as tinder. It took a dozen strikes before the cloth caught, a tiny glow that seemed impossibly fragile in the massive darkness of the warehouse. But she nurtured it carefully, feeding it with smaller pieces of cotton until it grew into a flame big enough to sustain itself. She held the burning cloth to the nearest bale and watched as the fire caught, spreading across the compressed cotton with a hungry eagerness that was almost alive. Within minutes, the flames had grown from a small flicker to a roaring column that climbed toward the ceiling, and she knew it was time to leave. She ran for the door, her heart pounding with adrenaline and fear and satisfaction all mixed together, and she emerged into the street where Isaiah was waiting with panic written across his face. They could see the orange glow through the warehouse windows now, growing brighter by the second, and they knew they had minutes at most before someone noticed and raised the alarm. They ran toward the docks, toward the place where Ruthanne had spent so many years of her life, and she had an idea that was even more audacious than burning the warehouse. There were cotton bales stored on the dock itself, she remembered, waiting to be loaded onto boats, and if she could set those on fire and push them into the river, the current would carry them downstream toward Harrington's plantation, spreading the destruction beyond just the warehouse. They reached the docks and found exactly what Ruthanne remembered: 20 bales stacked near the water's edge, awaiting tomorrow's loading. She used the last of her tinder to light the first one, and then she used that flaming bale to light others, working quickly while Isaiah kept watch and called out warnings when anyone approached. Within 10 minutes, half the bales were burning, turning the night into something that resembled daylight, and Ruthanne began pushing them toward the water's edge. Her strength, the same strength that had made her valuable to masters, now served a different purpose. as she heaved burning bales into the Mississippi, watching them splash into the current and begin their journey downstream. The river itself seemed to catch fire as more bales hit the water, floating rafts of flame that the current carried south toward Harrington's estate, like messages written in burning cotton. Behind them, they heard shouts as people finally noticed the warehouse fire and began organizing to fight it, and Ruthanne knew their time was up. She pushed the last burning bale into the river, and then grabbed Isaiah's hand, and together they ran, sprinting away from the docks, through alleys and back streets they had known years ago. They heard the alarm bell ringing from the center of town, summoning men to fight the fire, and they used the chaos and confusion to make their escape. By the time the sun rose over the river, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of pink and orange, the warehouse had burned to its foundation and taken 3 neighboring buildings with it, destroying what would later be estimated as $70,000 worth of cotton and property. The burning bales that floated downstream had set fire to several docks and 1 small warehouse on Harrington's property, adding another $10,000 to the total damage. And Ruthanne and Isaiah had disappeared into the dawn, vanishing as completely as if they had never existed, swallowed by the morning fog that rose off the Mississippi like the breath of the river itself. They walked north out of Natchez as the town mobilized to fight fires and assess damage. 2 more people among the chaos of a crisis, and no one stopped them or questioned them because everyone was too busy dealing with the immediate emergency. By noon, they were 10 miles away, following back roads toward Tennessee, and by evening they had covered 20 miles with determination pushing them forward despite exhaustion. They walked through the night, knowing that once the fires were controlled, attention would turn to finding who had started them, and they needed to be as far away as possible before that investigation began. They reached the Tennessee settlement 4 days later, exhausted and hungry, but alive and triumphant in a way that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with survival. Ruth looked at them with eyes that knew without asking where they had been and what they had done, and she told them they could not stay, that the repercussions of whatever they had done would spread like ripples in a pond and eventually reach even here. But she also told them she was proud of them, proud that they had fought back in a world that taught slaves that fighting back was impossible, and she gave them supplies and directions to another settlement farther north where they might finally be able to stop running. The story of the Natchez fire spread through the slave community like wildfire of its own, growing in the telling until it became something larger than the facts could support. Some versions claimed that a slave army had attacked the town, that dozens of warehouses had burned, that masters had been killed in the blaze. Other versions focused on Ruthanne specifically, transforming her from a woman into a symbol, a figure of resistance whose name was whispered in cabins across Mississippi as proof that slaves were not powerless, that rage could find expression even in the most controlled circumstances, that the river itself could be turned into a weapon against those who believed themselves untouchable. The truth was simpler and somehow more powerful. That one woman with nothing but her strength and her anger had struck back at the system that had taken everything from her, and in doing so, had reminded both slaves and masters that human beings, pushed to extremity, were capable of extraordinary acts. Ruthanne and Isaiah eventually settled in a small town in Ohio, far enough north that slave catchers rarely ventured there, and the law generally protected free blacks from being seized and returned south. Isaiah opened a carpentry shop that became known for the quality of its work, and Ruthanne found employment at a mill where her strength was valued and her wages were her own. They married again in a ceremony that this time had legal weight, standing before a white minister who treated them with the dignity that all people deserved, and they built a life that was ordinary in all the best ways. They had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son, and they raised them to understand that freedom was precious, and that justice sometimes required courage that looked like madness to those who had never been denied their humanity. In Mississippi, Harrison Harrington never recovered financially from the warehouse fire. The loss of cotton combined with the cost of rebuilding destroyed his liquidity, and within 2 years he was forced to sell off portions of his plantation to cover debts. Cyrus Dalton stayed on as overseer for another year, but left when Harrington could no longer afford to pay him properly, moving to Alabama, where his reputation for cruelty preceded him and eventually caught up with him when a slave he was whipping fought back and killed him with his own bullwhip. Bartholomew Winters recovered the money Isaiah had stolen through insurance, but the theft and the fire and the escape of 2 slaves he had considered controllable shook his confidence in the system that had made him wealthy. He never admitted doubt publicly, but those who knew him said he was different afterward, more cautious and somehow diminished, as if recognizing that the foundation his prosperity rested on was less stable than he had believed. The burning of the Natchez warehouse and the flaming bales that floated down the Mississippi became part of the mythology of slave resistance, a story told and retold with variations that reflected the hopes and fears of both the enslaved and their masters. Some versions ended with Ruthanne being caught and executed, a cautionary tale about the futility of resistance. Other versions ended with her escaping to Canada or even Africa, transforming her from a real person into a legend of absolute freedom. But the truth, as it so often does, lay somewhere between the extremes. Ruthanne Lewis lived to be 69 years old, dying in her sleep in the house she and Isaiah had built with their own hands in Ohio. She worked hard, loved her family, and never spoke publicly about what she had done that night in Natchez, because some stories were too dangerous to tell in a world where slavery might be ended. But its consequences lingered like smoke that never quite cleared. Her children and grandchildren knew, though, knew that the strong woman who raised them and taught them to stand up for themselves had once turned the Mississippi River into a weapon, had once made the water itself carry her vengeance downstream toward the masters who thought they could drown hope without consequence. And when they told the story to their own children in years to come, they made sure to emphasize not just the fire and the destruction, but also the careful planning, the courage, and the understanding that sometimes surviving requires not just enduring but also striking back, making your existence impossible to ignore, even in a world determined to erase you. Ruthanne of Mississippi did not destroy slavery with her act of vengeance, but she reminded everyone who heard her story that enslaved people were not passive victims, but human beings capable of resistance, capable of turning the tools and territory of their oppression against those who wielded them, capable of making even a river remember their rage and carry it forward into history.